Hello, guys. I noticed a comment somebody put um, on my channel today, and it was in regards to, which was the video? That's right, the collapse of the West. And they actually said it all went down the drain when the banks started using fractional reserve banking. Um, Not exactly. You know, when we talk about fractional reserve banking, it's actually got deep roots. It's not something modern. Modern day, banking practices have an evolution of these older practices, but it goes all the way back to the era of gold and silver when that was traded. Goldsmiths would issue um, promissory notes. So we provide a promise that you can redeem that in gold or silver. And pretty much they would, which were late, that was later, sort of, it was used as a means of exchange, obviously. The Smiths, so these are the goldsmiths, which came out of, these sort of people came out of the old artisans of, that produced the weapons and stuff like that in the medieval time and stuff like that, these sort of guys. And so these people that use the deposited gold to issue loans with interest, and sort of, you could say, early forms of fractional banking were born in that regard. A lot of us have this tendency to think that pretty much it's because of the education system, which is just a joke, because we're taught this sort of economic system that capitalism is a sort of a market-based economy, that as if market-based economies have not existed in the past. What do you think existed in the early parts of civilization? The first kingdoms, they had markets. They had very underdeveloped, very primitive markets in that sense, but they still had markets. They were barter economies. So capitalism is not a barter economy. It may trade in commodities, like early mercantile capitalism was sort of trading in commodities and finished goods that were manufactured. In the early stages, this was, a more rudimentary type manufacturing methods. As the Industrial Revolution took off, more sophisticated approaches to manufacturing took place, and you could value add. But generally speaking, capitalism is very different to these older types of barter type economies. What capitalism, the difference between capitalism is, you're not exchanging in a market certain goods and they have a certain value based on the demand, the supply and demand. What you've got on top of all that of a traditional market economy, you've got the ability to generate credit. Okay? So you could take value from the future and bring it into the past and provide a loan. That means generate. Even if you've got, even if these old blacksmiths or the early bankers had some level of gold in order to underpin their activity, to some extent they were creating money out of nothing. So this goes to the heart of capitalism, creating money out of nothing. So the only difference is in the modern world, we've amplified that with a central bank that allows us to amplify the whole thing to greater stupendous levels. that at the core is taking something from the future and pretty much using it to invest to grow an economy rapidly. You couldn't do that under a barter economy, but you can under capitalism because of credit. Without credit, you could not have this explosion in growth that you get under capitalism. But as a consequence of that is you get what are called cyclical boom busts, which are small. Then people will, the system will recover to some extent, and then you'll have another boom bust, smaller ones, which will escalate. And as these, over time, what happens is the assets that are being accumulated by a smaller and smaller group of people, restrict this, to some extent, the supply, pushing those values much higher. Now, in the past, that was much, the sort of level of between the boom busts and, the 80, 100 years sort of big sort of boom bust that would happen at the end of these multiple cycles of small boom busts, which is basically credit expansion, then contraction is what it is, the money supply, in a sense. You don't even need a central bank to do that. It's just that those people start not lending, holding on. So the supply that those banks or those people that have that capital to provide into the market, they withhold it, whether it's a bank or whether it's a private individual in the past that withheld it and said, we've got these wars are going on, at the moment we're losing quite a lot of ships. I'm not going to really invest. I'm going to hold my money back. That's a contraction in the supply of money in the economy to basically allow for entrepreneurs to go out and do more trade or more economic activity. So it's at the heart of capitalism. That's what gives us its dynamism. What we've actually done in modern era, we've sort of we've put it on steroids. That's the problem. At the past, at least, it was the level of credit supply was within certain bounds. People, yes, they would go bust now and then, but the majority of the society didn't really feel it. It was really the investors and people like that, because there was markets where people speculated, and that's where it was the big end of town that usually used to lose a lot of their wealth to these speculative activities. But the general society in itself didn't actually feel the consequences of those crises. If you go back and look at the crises like the long recession and all the other ones before, it really hit the upper middle class, which was a much smaller group of people. Most of the rest of society didn't really, it was just like a blip of unimportance to their lives. But as capitalism has grown and, and with central banks sort of putting it on steroids, it's brought about this massive growth of the modern world, but also what it's done, it's created stupendous bubbles, much harder to manage and more volatile than in the past. That's what modern day fractional banking has done. So it's not really that it didn't exist, but the thing is the supply of credit, which is what really money is in a sense. I mean, it is a means of exchange as well. It does have other roles in that regard. There is real money, which I call gold and silver, but that's for another day, another discussion. But fundamentally, it's at the core of the system itself. Now, obviously, when you tie it, you restrain it to some extent to a level where it's backed by something. It's not just a fiat currency like we have today. It's actually backed by real money, whether that's gold or whether that's a mixed bag of commodities or something that you can actually redeem it in with some sort of level of confidence. Then, but that also will affect your growth. Your growth will be much slower in sort of general terms, but you still can achieve greater economic growth without, this excessive amount of money supply, which really only helps the big end of town push up, all their assets to these stupendous heights, way above what their returns are in many cases. And that's what creates these massive bubbles because of the availability of cheap credit is what central banks have provided. So they have amplified that weakness in the system in a sense. It's both a strength, but also a weakness if it expands beyond the real economy in a sense. And that's what central banks have created. They've created the ability to actually amplify that where in the past you couldn't to that level. So the way people created real wealth was basically by producing goods and services. That didn't mean you didn't have these cyclical crises and long crises to some extent. Yes, you did. But tell me one system that humans have created which is perfect, stable, and without a crisis. None. Just look at the whole of history of humanity. This is a fallen, this is pretty much our fall from grace. In this realm, we're trying to find our way back to God. But pretty much this isn't a perfect, world that we're living in. So we need to recognize that human systems are going to be vulnerable because humans are pretty much chaotic creatures, and we tend to basically have a tendency of not a lot of us never following rules or all sorts of things. As a consequence, no system is guaranteed to not have some faults, problems. Probably one of the most dynamic, strongest systems that we've ever created has probably been modern day capitalism. It's got a lot of flaws, I'll give you that. And at some point, it probably will vanish. It will cease to exist. It will be a long time before that happens. It probably will get to the stage where, we've got some type of replication machine, a bit like in Star Trek, you've got the replicator, something of that similar thing. If you can take matter from an asteroid or from whatever and create whatever you like, well, you don't need a market you don't need anything. Maybe then it's going to be like a market of ideas, or bragging rights. And then, somebody's come up with the, I've come up with a better thing. You get a bragging little pin put on you, great. And and other people can replicate it if they want to or not. So it's going to be a very different future if we develop such systems, and it goes in that regard. And the way exponential growth, the sort of technological, the way we're moving forward, the potential for that beyond my lifetime, but is a plausible possibility when we've seen the ability to draw atom by atom actual text using a tunneling electron microscope. So we can actually just grab an atom and move it. So, if you can create a more sophisticated system of that to be able to replicate things, you'd be able to change all sorts of things into whatever you like. So that would change the economy in a completely different way. So I don't believe in capitalism being forever. Anybody that believes that is deluded. But that's what we've got currently, and it's really, do we continue the way it has actually been run up to this stage in that regard, where we've got fiat currencies which can be exploited by a very small minority, and where they can use the method of actually creating a big supply, which they have first preference, or they get most of the benefits from, because you debase your currency, and as a consequence, their assets appreciate. They make a lot, but the rest of us have to work harder and are having lower purchasing power over time, which is only slightly mitigated by cheap energy, which allows to keep the prices down of certain things, and technological innovation, productivity. So they steal the majority of the value from the cheap energy, and they steal the majority of the innovation in society, and productivity. You know, the banking elites, these sort of people, the parasites, as I call them. So I'm not. This is not a criticism of a gold standard type capitalism, but it's a criticism of the modern type. You know, after the Bretton Woods Conference, after the Second World War, we ended up with a gold standard type. A dollar, 1 ounce of gold worth $35, and or everything else pegged to that, or eventually floating against that in one way or another. But at least there was real money underpinning that. And that actually constrained a lot of things. That meant people had to produce a lot of energy, more energy, be more productive, in order to create more wealth. That means real wealth. That means producing goods and services from productivity, from economic activity, and utilizing cheaper forms of energy, which were basically the hydrocarbon-based energies that we used in the 50s and 60s onwards. When we abandoned that system, and moved into this new paradigm of, you know, fiat currencies, and each time we had a crisis, to print our way out of that crisis, what we did was we amplified the effects. Now, that to a large extent was, you could say, masked because of cheap energy and productivity that was happening. By, you could say, by the, you know, early parts of the 21st century, you could say innovation in robotics sort of, you know, had become more anemic, weaker. You know, we're getting innovations, but, you know, still the level of productivity in manufacturing was starting to decline. It's the reason why eventually a lot of the first world exported a lot of the manufacturing jobs to the third world, because labor costs being cheaper there was still more competitive than robotics. So that was part of the big problem. The reason why was that the first world was starting to have more and more expensive energy. This is what was undermining it. So it was really energy that was becoming more costly. With cheaper energy, the first world, the West or whatever, could remain competitive. So you'd still get growth in the other parts of the world, development, but at the same time, there would be some level of competitiveness still existing in manufacturing in Western countries. So a lot of countries like Scandinavia and Germany and all that went into innovations, into the high-end type manufacturing, because that was into niche areas, but not everyone could do that. Italy was struggling to do that. Many other countries were struggling to do that, because, you know, that required massive levels of investment in R&D and all that, which Scandinavia and Germany had done in the past. And so they were able to, you could say, reap the benefits, where other countries hadn't done to the same level, and so were struggling, really struggling. And you could see it through the Euro crisis and stuff like that. So it's more of a complicated picture. the only way forward is to go back to cheap energy. There's no other way. It's really that simple. Obviously, I would rather see us, if we're going to do any reset, go back to real money, to a gold standard, to reduce the level. That would also reduce the level of inequity in society. So people who are productive and increase the productivity of society will basically reap more benefits, like they did in the 50s and 60s. And the differences between the top end of town, the differences in terms of how much they got out of the pie, was much less. It was, anywhere between 10, 20 times, sometimes slightly higher. Now it's like hundreds or thousands of times greater. That means in terms of wealth difference, they're getting a vastly bigger part of the pie because of the modern day fiat currencies and the money printing. That's really what's given them a lot of wealth. It's what we saw the explosion in the 80s. It was, I mean, you couldn't, as one person described it, you couldn't open up your door at home without having a mountain of credit cards under you, in the entrance. So pretty much this explosion in money printing obviously meant that, and less wages growth that took place in the same period of time, because real nominal, in nominal terms, was declining year in, year out. And so the one person's liability is another person's asset. So pretty much the rich were basically making sure that they were generating more and more of this growth in the money supply through the central banks, obviously, through their friends in the central banks. And so they needed to basically, you could say they co-opted the rest of the society, is making credit easy. Obviously, if you're expanding the money supply, you can make credit easy. So they say, well, you've got a credit card, go and buy everything you need. But long term, that's not sustainable. They used that extra credit that was being generated for other purpose, not to buy things, but to buy assets, which kept on appreciating as the money supply increased, and there was more money chasing less and less stuff. Supply and demand pushes up asset prices. And so they were amplifying that. And that's the problem. It's not so much the fractional reserve system, it's the amplification of that has actually created these stupendous modern crises that are far greater in magnitude than in the past and have the potential of causing vast levels of devastation. That's the sort of problem. And we can see it. The first, the roaring 20s, from the moment Woodrow Wilson allowed the central bank to be created. It was actually done at night. Some of the people in Congress and all that were asleep. They just, the ones that were awake voted, and the mates of, if you go back, it's for another day, the story, but it was, this was the early stage of the emergence of these globalists. They had a vision to control the entire planet. Pretty much, this was American capital that wanted to basically control the world and displace the British Empire. That was their plan. They were the emerging power. They were the China of their day. And, due to the Europeans having their little constant wars and bankrupting themselves nearly to oblivion, the Americans suffered no consequence of First World War or Second World War. They came out of it stronger, with massive productivity, with a lot of cheap energy, which because they were the Saudi Arabia of the world at the time. They were producing more hydrocarbon energy than anyone on the planet. So they were the industrial machine of the planet. They were the energy machine of the planet, the suppliers, and the credit suppliers of the planet. So pretty much they covered all three. They ticked off all three boxes. And that's why the US became dominant, and pretty much Britain had to give way. They did a cozy deal, and it allowed the British to have some control of the money supply that went into Europe. And the French had the OECD, which is, the development organization that was established to sort of rebuild Europe in a sense in those early days, and it's sort of to keep the French happy and to give them a role of controlling the supply or the certain projects, control of certain projects, development projects in Europe, while the British got the better stuff, which was what ended up becoming the Euro exchange, which is really the dollar coming in and being provided from the City of London, which is very unregulated. It's like a little enclave, a bit like the way the Vatican state is within. It's like a separate state. It does whatever it likes. It's a banker's paradise, basically, to be able to move a lot of, capital around the world through that. So what people need to understand is that it's a different beast. The way we have to turn this whole thing around is we need cheap energy. If we continue this way, Asia, by 2035, the BRICS nations will have a higher GDP than the G7, which is major European powers and the US combined. That's the future, because they're getting cheap energy. The West is going woke and broke. We've got expensive energy. So ultimately, even if we want to be able to deal with this crisis, remember what I said, it's not the level of debt. The US has had bigger debts. I mean, the US currently, we're talking about they want to push it up to 33 trillion. But even where it is now, which is around 31 and a half or close to that, even at that level or beyond that level, if you've got cheap energy, like what happened after the Second World War, and you've got a president that actually wants to bring back manufacturing, start getting cheaper energy into the economy and making the economy more productive, more resilient and stronger, putting more people back to work and all that, you will be able to turn the whole thing around. We can turn the whole thing around. But you need a leadership, not the current people. The current people are going to drive us into war and destruction. They're not going to solve the problem. There's a few people like Trump that gets it. He understands it's energy. A lot of the others don't. That's the problem with them. They just don't get it. He understands cheap energy, cheap energy, cheap energy. It's the only way to turn the ship around. Windmills and solar farms are not going to do it. They will amplify this crisis. They will make it worse. And you can't fight expensive energy that causes massive inflation with higher and higher interest rates, because you put yourself into a debt trap. The higher the interest rates, the inability to service those debts. The you know, the lower you know, if you lower the interest rates, you just blow the whole thing up. Pretty much, they've actually put themselves into a trap. The only way you can deal with this is with cheap energy, and then to rein in the banking system. That's the only way of doing it. I mean, when you've got JP Morgan holding on to, you know, the equivalent of all these asset classes and all that, 53 trillion. That's just one institution that's double what is called the US economy. Deutsche Bank, 42. These are ginormous numbers. With the current situation of expensive energy, these institutions are not viable long term. I don't know what is going through the leaders in the West, but, you know, if they continue on this course, they are going to basically create one of the biggest crises since, you know, 1929. It's going to be even bigger than that. This will be the true dethroning of the US dollar. That's definitely going to happen. If, you know, already trade in US dollars is declining and starting to pick up pace, people are getting out of the dollar. More and more central banks are buying up gold. Everybody's buying up gold for the reason because they know a reset is going to happen. And this is the reality of where we're heading. The US, a digital reset, a digital currency reset, or any other Ponzi scheme or whatever, isn't going to fix the problem. That's just for them to control. That's a different agenda altogether. You know, we're talking about here. What do you think Janet Yellen wants to go to China? She wants to do a deal. It reminds me of the deals in the 1930s that the US did. They went to their creditors and said, look, to the foreign creditors, we'll cover all that with gold and a few other things. Land, who knows what's in the list of goodies for their creditors to basically sign off. On the other hand, for the domestics, I don't know what's going to happen to people that are holding paper, you know, in the US citizens, that is. I know back in the 30s, there was like sort of a 6-month moratorium, then a few other things that were done over that period of time. Then eventually there was lowering to some extent of interest rates and then, you know, putting more money into the economy and just ballooning the whole thing up to the 244% of GDP. But then it was different. You could do that. You could actually grow the money supply massively up to, as I said, towards the end of the Second World War, it was 244% of GDP, massively. But you could do that because of cheap energy. That's the reality. It was cheap energy that really happened. And also that, you know, it did help that there was a lot of destruction in the in Europe after the Second World War. And so obviously they had less competition in finished goods. So they were the main exporter at the time of finished goods and raw materials. So, and capital, because that actually built a big fortune through that period of growth. So there may have been debt, but there was a lot of economic activity through the war years, and, you know, so, but we don't need to do that because, you know, nuclear bombs really throw a spanner in the works, as you can understand. So that's not the best way of doing it. An easier way is to basically rein in some of the spending that's a bit over the top, and to try and get more and more people off off welfare and into real jobs. And that will mean reforms will be required within all Western economies. And also, we need to jettison all the green bullshit completely. We need to go back to cheap energy, because that's the only way we can deal with high debt levels. We need to become productive. We need to be able to generate more wealth. And also, we need to some extent, in the short term, like they did back in the 50s, is the higher marginal rates need to go up in terms of tax, not on businesses, but on individuals, and take a lot of the concessions away in that regard, because they've benefited through this money supply. So I have no qualms about taxing these elites like they did after the Second World War. And by the mid-50s, the US nearly had practically wiped out most of that debt. And also, it was the golden years of capitalism, because the middle classes were able to balloon and grow rapidly in that sort of environment, because they had less competition from the top end of town. So there's only so much of the pie. It's how you divide it that plays a big role. And I think that the people that are the most productive should get more of it, because they've contributed to more of it. And those who are parasitically exploiting through financialization should have some limitations put on them. So I've got no problems with that. There are other mechanisms beyond tax to do that. So there are other ways. You can change the type of investment, where you can't export as much capital or put it into non-productive areas of the economy. There's a lot of things that can be done. You've got to be very careful to sort of get the balance right, because if you go too hard in one direction and all that, you can't produce forever. There's only so many workers, and then labor costs will go up. So many that you can do within the productive sector of the economy. So it has to be, to some extent balanced, in that regard. But at the same time, as I said, it's not a perfect system. So nobody can give perfect answers to these things. It's a matter of playing around with some reforms, changing a few things, and see how it goes. If it works, good. If it doesn't, so there'll be different approaches and all that. But ultimately, what we need to do is constrain, to some extent, this money printing. It has to sort of end at some point, but not immediately. You have to sort of come off it slowly. So there's sort of people that want to just say, and I don't like these ceilings. They should have never actually even considered ceilings, these debt ceilings and all that. It's just it's illogical. The moment a population grows, the moment a population, just general economic activity will push up. A bigger population will grow a bigger state. A smaller population will grow a smaller. It's just the way it is, and those will shrink. To basically put limits, arbitrary limits in that regard, is illogical. Now, to use sort of percentages is a bit more reasonable in that regard, to basically sort of contain, net debt to certain percentages puts a certain level of discipline. But to put these arbitrary amounts is ridiculous, because if you basically your GDP is growing in a sense, it can accommodate to some extent. It will happen inevitably to some extent. You know, you've got more citizens, you've got more things that you have to do, more police that you require to police, more hospitals to build, and all these sort of things, more people to educate and whatever. As that increases, obviously, the amount will have to go up. But as long as it's within certain constraints of a percentage within the economy, then it's not a problem because it's serviceable and all that is what I'm trying to say. So these sort of debt ceilings are just illogical, it's stupid. Percentages saying you must constrain the government sector to such a percent of GDP. Well, that makes more logical sense. And then how you structure that will depend on a lot of things. You know, that's a different conversation, or because that doesn't affect how much, you know, the amount in terms of dollars or euros or whatever may continue to grow if the population grows, or if it shrinks, it'll actually decline in the amount. That becomes irrelevant. It's the percentage, which makes more logical sense of how much you're going to allocate in terms of the wealth that's generated within the society. And that's then a political conversation, and then people will vote accordingly how they feel about after they've heard the political conversation. So this is not trying to basically say, you know, this or that, or give a left or right answer in terms of policy. It's to point out some obvious lunacies or some obviously idiotic things that we do and say and whatever. It's to sort of clear that fog in a sense. The key thing we have to understand is cheap energy allows us to improve our living standards and our lives. And you can't print your money to print your way to success. And contracting severely the money supply is also not an advisable thing to do at the same time, you know. So, you know, because that just collapses national income. And if you do that too rapidly, you end up in a depression, a la Greece. So you've got to be very careful how you do these things, is what I'm trying to say. But you have to have a plan. You know, it's not enough to say, well, you know, there's this problem, and then people take you know, one approach or another approach. It seems like it's either basically contract the bloody thing to hell and kill it that way, or expand it and blow it up the other way. They're not solutions. You know, they're just basically ideological arguments that people have. You know, it's the sort of the Keynesians against the Austrians. It's just ideological. Both are wrong. And both are right in some degrees, in some aspects. But really, both fail to acknowledge the underlying weaknesses of the capitalist system, of every system, you know, that's ever existed, that humans have ever created. They're imperfect systems. That's why I'm saying that, you know, and that's where then politics comes into play, and people, you know, will use elements of both those ideologies and create some sort of Frankenstein construct, because that's all we create, even under a quasi gold standard. It's a Frankenstein concept, you know. And as I've always said to people, static closed systems that you see, these models that the Keynesians create or the Austrians create, they work really well. It's a bit like thermodynamics in a closed system. Works perfectly. But we're talking about an open system with a lot of varied levels of entropy, decay and change and alterations, things that can't be anticipated. That's why no system will ever, as long as the universe exists, as long as entropy is driving time, drives change in all sorts of ways and complexities, in unforeseen ways, we will always, to some extent, have failures, crises, and stuff like that. Unavoidable. Doesn't matter what economic system. all these utopians, they'll tell you they can make the perfect system. We've seen all their attempts. They've ended up in catastrophes. We can't make perfect system. We can't make perfect capitalism. We can't make perfect socialism. We can't make perfect anything. Even our devices, stuff that we make, technology, it all decays. It all falls apart. It needs to be replaced. We just need to accept this reality and stop being so ideological about this. I'm a practical person. What works? What practical steps do we have to do? The main thing that we have to do is, as I've always said, is more cheap energy. Because humans are lazy. Humans are not going to come up with perfect solutions, ever. You can wait until the end of the universe. Not going to happen. You'd be completely and utterly deluding yourself if you believe that that's going to happen. It won't. We will continue to create new bubbles in the future and other bubbles, and we'll accumulate more bubbles again and another crisis in another 100 years. It's just the way we do it. So let's just shelve the idea that we can make a perfect system, because we can't. And let's learn to manage practically what we've got and make incremental improvements and some functional, what I call functional practical stuff. But let's take the, how would you call it? Let's take the monkey off our back. You know what the monkey on our back is? Expensive energy. When you don't have a monkey on your back and you've got cheap energy, politics become very simple. Just go back to the 50s and 60s. Shitloads of cheap energy. Politicians, some of them didn't even turn up or slept in Parliament. They hardly passed legislation back then. You go back to the Menzies and Chifley era back then in Australia, for instance, or even in the US in the 50s and 60s, or in Europe. It was just like, this is why sometimes people have, you could say, these sort of reminiscing the 50s and 60s, most people say it was so boring. I mean, when you don't have crises, obviously it's boring, you're not being entertained. So, I think somebody said that humans express themselves through, misery. So, obviously it was the least inspiring, the most boring time in the history of humanity were the 50s and 60s. But they were the most stable as well. So, and even though tax rates were slightly different between countries because they had different debts to deal with from coming out of the war, things like that, Australia only had the top marginal rate was 67%. Australia had less war debts to deal with, to bring them down. So different economies had different issues. And even though taxes were coming down from the 60s on into the 70s were coming down, and from the late 50s, actually, in some parts. So people that claim, high taxes were the problem that basically caused the 70s. No, it was actually expensive energy, especially when the tap was shut off by the Arabs. That really was a shock to the system. And then we continue on after that, because really after that we see this massive credit supply that gets, that's when they make all those reforms. Bounce back the system, pump more stuff in. And we had the new Ponzi scheme that we were developing with the fiat currencies. And as a consequence, this had a profound negative effect, but it created a lot of cheap credit around the world, which saw a lot of the emerging economies start to grow and then attract more capital, like China and places like that. And as they attracted more capital, economic activity, it's sort of like it snowballs. And everybody wants to get into the game to make more of this. So greed, again, driving it into mad levels. But fundamentally, when we look at these sort of things, again, had we actually had cheaper energy, because it was the same time as countries like India, China, Southeast Asia, all these other countries were growing rapidly, they were sucking in a lot of energy, but energy production around the world wasn't keeping pace. The real problem wasn't actually the Middle East. The Middle East was trying to pump more and more. Now, politically, geopolitically, they may be responding differently. But back then, they were trying to get as much, because the US was providing guarantee to Saudi Arabia. They were trying to get as much oil out. The problem is the demand was exponentially growing. The problem is we especially we in the West who consume most of the global energy, are the biggest consumers of energy, we weren't willing to invest in energy within our own parts of the world. That was the problem. It's the West. As we became more affluent, we became more green. And as we became more green, we started putting the brakes on energy and resources and resource extraction within our own countries. And so you saw mining decline in North America, in Europe. And as a consequence of that, but the demand was still there for energy, so it was sucking it in from the rest of the world. That was the problem. That it's kept on growing and growing and growing and growing, but investment in the West was declining and declining and declining, and only growing in windmills and solar farms and these sort of things that produce very little. Actually, it's been estimated some of these technologies produce less energy than what it costs to produce them, the devices. So they're actually contributing negative amounts of energy into the system and costing the taxpayer an arm and a leg in terms of the amount of wastage of capital, of good capital, in poor energy systems. So, this is where a lot of this inflation is coming from. There's a lot of shale oil and gas in the North Sea, in Britain, on most of the continents of Europe, plus in North America. And if we started pulling that out in uranium and all these sort of things, we would be able to deal with our current calamities. Pretty much we would see a rapid reduction in oil prices, in uranium prices, in all these. What would that do? It would lower energy costs. What would that do? It would raise living standards for all people in the developed and developing world. And it also would do another thing. It would lower inflation, which may mean it would also make us more productive. We'd be producing, our GDP would grow, national product, and the debt to GDP would shrink to more serviceable levels. Total national income grows, debt to total national income is less. That's what cheap energy gives you. That explains the 1950s and 60s. It took a war to build up the capacity of energy and productive capacity, which was then converted to consumer items, because technologically we're at a stage where we could do that and mass produce those items. But without cheap energy, we couldn't do it. The two came together perfectly at that time. We can do it again. We can do something similar to the Bretton Woods and reset the game. But we're not prepared to. Because at the moment, the West is fighting itself. See, after the Second World War, the West was united. North America was united. Optimistic future. Europe could see that this was the end of these catastrophic wars, and we're moving into a new sort of era of, that pretty much the West was all united, working together to develop economically. And so there was optimism. We don't have that anymore. What do we need to do? Have a World War III to wake up? The problem with World War III is that if nukes are used, the game's over. That's the problem. That's not the sort of reset that I want. And I don't think most of you guys want that. But we need to get people in power that understand that we need cheap energy, because that can do a proper reset for all of us. And we need to go back to some sort of form of gold standard. We need to rein in these financial parasites, that are stealing the productivity of the rest of us. That's what we need to do. We really need to rein in these crony capitalists, because they are truly, and to shrink the financial sector back to what it was after the Second World War, 15% of GDP, not this 40, 50%. When you get to those sort of levels, you need to generate, this is why the money printing has to continue, because you need to generate more and more debt. Remember, your debt is their asset, the bank's asset. If the bank can't lend, the worst thing, the biggest nightmare for a banker is to have a shitload of money and not being able to lend it. That's why, they had the subprime and all that. Why? Because they've got shitloads, they need to push it somewhere. But if you go back to real money and you shrink the financial sector and grow the real economy, which is manufacturing, primary resources, other services and stuff like that, then you've got a healthier economy. Scandinavian countries have got a bit of that going, They're sort of, after the disaster of the socialist period, when they were doing all these crazy things, they sort of woke up to themselves to realise that even they then succumbed to this green bullshit, and the achievements that they had in the 80s and 90s were really eroded onwards because of this bullshit agenda. So they're on the right track in sort of opening up the economy to competitive pressures, but at the same time, they started then going back. They started reducing nuclear, they started reducing coal, they started doing that. Look at Germany at the moment. It's a basket case. People are going out and cutting down trees in Germany, destroying the nature that they claim they want to protect. Crazy stuff is happening. This is the problem that, that's why I'm and uff about it. We need to produce more cheap energy. It should be a priority in every country. Infrastructure. We need, like in Australia, we need an infrastructure bank. Like we had with the Commonwealth. We could do it with an act of parliament, having the postal system, because post office exists everywhere. And they already do some banking for other banks, other institutions. So why not have a development bank tied to them that can provide capital to develop other parts of Australia, manufacturing in the north. There's some plans of of putting major rail corridors in the north and linking between the two Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and being able to move resources back and forward and both and have productive capacities at both ends, which will bring down the cost as long as you've got cheap energy. But look what's happening. Woodside Petroleum are trying to get more gas out of the Northwest Cape, and you've got these green lunatics. Gas cannot pollute the waterways. It's just nonsense. It's carbon. Carbon diffuses into the whether in the atmosphere or diffuses into water, and it takes to get into the deep water up to 600 to 800 years. It's lunacy. Yes, you make it. Let's say even if you got an oil spill, it's a hydrocarbons at the end of the day are carbon. Remember, it was dead animals. Or these hydrocarbons, carbon is in every single animal and species, including us. So when that degrades in nature eventually, yes, it may create a pollution but eventually it just degrades and goes away. There's no sign of it after that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have good environmental policies to prevent some of this sort of stuff. And we've got better technology now. We can do things better. So I'm not against that. I believe in that to some extent. But we should not be stopping growing these things. It's illogical. Preserving this planet for who? In a couple of billion, what is it, 1.5 billion, I think, years from now, even whether we're around or not. Well, if we continue doing this sort of shit we're doing now, maybe not. But our star will grow into a red giant, then it will contract back to a white dwarf. But when it does do that initially, as it's growing and expanding outwards, it pretty much will destroy everything on this planet. So preserving what for whom? Okay, you allow these species to survive for 1 billion years. In terms of the scheme of the universe, there's no logic to it. That doesn't mean we should become vandals either. Okay, it would be like, just because you can tear your house apart, you don't do it. Okay, you want to live in a home that's reasonable, it's reasonably clean, in some order, because there is blowback in a sense in that regard. But let's not get too hypersensitive as well, is what I'm trying to say, because we've become far too hypersensitive. Species have been going extinct all the time. Other species will take their niche. Who says, with the dinosaurs being taken out, we were able to come into existence. So if that hadn't happened, and who says that if some other critter gets taken out, it's not going to create a new niche for another critter? What, that other critter doesn't have a right? Is that what you're saying? Are we now picking winners? Which critter will basically evolve more effectively than other critters? We are part of this biosphere. We are interacting with other animals. We are in competition, and I'm a speciesist and proud to be a speciesist, no different than any other species on this planet that is proud to be a speciesist as well. You will not see any other animal on this planet prioritizing anybody else other than its own species. So it's not a dirty word. Just because humans can actually have misanthropic thoughts put there by crackpots and ideologues who hate humanity, because we can have those thoughts, it doesn't mean they're right. So whether you take it from a Darwinian point of view, even though by natural selection, I don't believe in that, too much complex information. It's for another day, another argument. I do believe in evolution, but not by natural selection in that regard, the way it's been described. But even if you don't, and you've got a theist point of view on that, or a theist evolutionary point of view, which is probably closer to what I am, whether one or the other, and I know I'm going to upset some of my orthodox friends on that issue, but I sort of take the approach of the fathers of my faith who didn't take a position on this because they said, well, that's for scientists, not for us. Ours is faith. These things, others do take a strong position. They go, well, they point here, but I said, well, it doesn't actually talk about evolution, it just talks about other things. You're taking a more literal, and we don't take a literal sort of view in our tradition. So that's usually North Americans that have come into orthodoxy from Protestantism and tend to bring some of their creationist sort of approach, but that's for another day discussion. If they want to believe that, that's fine. That's for them as they like. I'm just telling you about me. But at the end of the day, even if you believe in the other approach, that we are central as the sentient, made in the image of God, central in that regard, to have dominion over everything. Or you take the Darwinian approach, which says the most adaptable survives. It's not the strongest or the smartest. That's just bullshit that was actually created by people like Huxley and others, and the eugenic lunatics, and eventually that ended up with lunatics like Adolf Hitler, and and we know the rest, where that ends up. When I talk about that sort of nonsense. But on the other hand, if you take that sort of approach, what they call science, well, you have to be a species, because if you accept Darwinian competition, that species that are more adaptable survive and outcompete other species, and those species, whether they're stronger or smarter, is irrelevant. They basically end up extinct because they're not adaptable to that environment, and one of the species is more adaptable and dominates that environment and actually shrinks the effective environment of that other species, and then the viability of that species becomes more compromised, and then at some point it goes extinct. So if you accept that we're part of this natural biosphere, then I'm a species. So I've got every right to dominate my environment, no more than any other species on this planet. And that goes to the Vagoons, that goes to all those idiots who claim science, but they sort of ignore or are selective based on their own agendas. Anyway, I think we've covered quite a few things in that regard. It sort of blew out from one thing and all that. I just thought, why not express some of my thoughts? Some of you people appreciate them. Some of my thoughts may be controversial for some of you, and others may excite them in different ways, and so please don't send me any hate mail. But yeah, my sort of views is I don't actually fly any specific flag on the economic side, and I don't really fly any specific flag on some of these other things. Why? Because the truth is somewhere in between. So on the economic front, the practical I'm more of a practical, eclectic type person. What works, what doesn't work will vary from time to time and period of time and what sort of mess we've put ourselves into may require a mix of approaches to try and get us out of that mess. If you take things too ideological, you'll end up not fixing the problem. But at the heart of, you could say, any species, any economy, any organism is energy. For us, it's ATP. For, our economies, it's called oil, gas, nuclear, these sort of things. Coal. Those are the things that can make our economies work. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and innovate and create other things. I mean, we didn't give up. We didn't evolve, you could say. It wasn't because we had a lack of rocks, stones, that we moved out of the Stone Age, or lack of copper and tin that we moved out of the Bronze Age. It was basically that over time we realized we could do things differently, or use other things or other materials or other types of energy. We moved from horsepower to, cars and aeroplanes with, kerosene, jet fuel. So, we've evolved over time, our economic system. We've evolved our energy systems. We will continue to do that. Carbon-based energies are not going to be forever. We'll probably move into fusion eventually at some point. If we're able to find an effective way of developing carbon nanotubes and developing space elevators, we'll be able to get into space much cheaper. And as a consequence of that, we may be able to create cheap shuttle systems that fly back and forward between Earth and the moon. And those shuttles can bring in helium-3, which is abundant on the moon, but very rare on Earth. And we can take that, we can put it into fusion reactors. And these fusion reactors don't need to be like the current tokamak and stuff like that require a lot of shielding, because they're using deuterium and tritium, and that produces, remember, deuterium has 1 neutron, tritium has 2. And so the release of those neutrons does do damage to the interior of the fusion reactor. Plus, so the materials there, costly, repairs and maintenance and stuff like that. So it's problematic to try and actually resolve the thing. Also, high levels of neutron radiation is problematic, trying to find effective shielding for humans and other things. So that's a problem. But moving over to helium-3, you don't have that problem. And also, you don't have to use the more inefficient, like, coal, nuclear, current nuclear technology, and sort of even these experimental fusion reactors. They will take that energy and put it through, a sort of a steam engine type. They'll power a steam engine in a sense, modern day, but and so it's still not as efficient. We're talking about, sub 30%. So there's a bit of a loss in energy and stuff like that. But on the other hand, if you can actually have helium-3 in a reactor and have an electrostatic sort of method of capturing that energy, because you can, with these sort of reactors. I've seen one model. What you would do is you don't have the neutron radiation problem. You don't have any of these things. You've got easier, more practical containment that's possible in those sort of reactors. And you can produce up to, theoretically, up to 70+% efficiency. Now that's really great. That is fantastic. Obviously, we probably won't get there, but even if we get to the sort of the 60 mark of efficiency, 60%, that's still double what we get from our current technologies. So that'll be far more cheaper energy, as long as we can tap into that sort of stuff. It's probably why the Chinese are showing a lot of interest with the moon, and the US as well. It's really about helium-3. It's the future of fusion power, pretty much. And, at that stage, once you get into that sort of energy system, why would you bother with oil and gas and stuff like that? You wouldn't, because that's going to give you, it's got greater density of energy, and it's going to give you even greater potential productivity and growth than you would get. You'd be able to produce even, goods and services even cheaper than petrochemicals. So it's not because we ran out of stones, remember, the same sort of concept. A smart society uses the cheapest form of energy. It doesn't lock itself and says, I'm only going to use this. No. Based on, you try and innovate and develop new forms of cheap energy, and you focus on getting the cheapest energy that you can find or develop. The problem is we've lost our way. Our society's gone insane, completely lost its marbles. This is why we are where we are, because we've really just lost the plot, and we need to get the message out to people that cheap energy, carbon-based energy at this point in time in our history, in the future, as I said, helium-3 potentially, but at this stage, fossil fuels are the main game. And if we don't bring back fossil fuels into our systems, we are going to be poorer for it. And the level of friction in our societies are going to escalate. And the problem is, once you got a lot of Germans angry, a lot of Italians angry, a lot of Americans angry, a lot of British angry, you've got a lot of angry apes out there. They're not thinking straight. And they're going to be pointing the finger at somebody else, always, human nature, ape nature, whatever you want to call it. And as a consequence of that, the drums of war will escalate. That's why, I hope that somebody with an understanding that doesn't want war, and especially a world war, thinks it's crazy and actually wants to invest in these sort of energy sources. In the US, it's pretty much Trump. Robert Kennedy, I'm not sure. He does have some positive things, he wants to sort of go after the deep state in that regard. So on that front, going after the deep state and the intelligence services and all that, the corruption that's in that sort of area, the military-industrial complex, he seems to be has a stronger agenda on that, which I agree with. And on the other hand, I'm not, I'm lukewarm about his sort of energy side, so to speak. I think he's too green in that regard. And at this point, the most, attractive person for me personally, as I said, I'm very eclectic. I'm not sort of left-right in that regard. I sort of, tend to be more of a centrist in my politics nowadays. And I can, in the past, I was quite a radical left-winger and communist and anarchist in my past as a youngster. So I've talked about that before. So, yes, I have read the manifesto and Das Kapital as well. And, empiricism, critique of Lenin on Kant. So, yeah, I have read all that sort of stuff. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Bakunin, Proudhon, and all sorts of other colourful characters of European philosophy. So I'm pretty much versed in a lot of that sort of stuff. So I have a deep knowledge of those sort of ideologies and those sort of thoughts in that regard. And sort of I've evolved beyond a lot of that, those isms, which I sort of have an extreme disdain in my current years, because I realise, they're just so flawed in so many aspects. I will criticise people if they misrepresent them, because I do know exactly what they say, So I will use the cane, because a lot of people, even on the communist stuff, they get it wrong. Like they'll say things like, "Oh, well, Marx said, to each according to his to each according to his needs, to each according to his worth." I don't even understand what that means. The first stage is what is state capital. Pretty much, the means of production are banks and everything are all owned by the state on behalf of the working class. What you end up with is an elite of party hacks that control everything and say, "We care for you little people down there," and exploit the thing for their own benefit. That's what really happens. We're talking about real human nature and real things that happen. The ideology sounds great. It's like a lot of ideologies and a lot of sort of belief systems, but yeah. The other part that it actually says talks nothing about equality. Actually, Marx was quite a bit hostile to equality, didn't believe in equality. The current crop talk about it all the time, about how all the working class are equal and we love you all and all that. That's just ideology. That's just bullshit. The original work, because who was Marx? I mean, he was a good friend of an industrialist family, the Engels, who owned industries I think it was in Manchester in the UK. So these were basically bourgeois capitalists who basically thought, we could actually change the way we run the society. A bit like, your modern day people like Mark Zuckerberg and people like this, these sort of people who have these utopian ideas of how to run society, these globalists and all that. Very similar, these people back then, in their thinking. But what is meant by each according to their worth? What it meant is that if you were lazy, you got nothing. If you were more productive, you got rewarded with more perks and more money or whatever. You got more rewarded. So, at the socialist stage, there was no equality in the manifesto. It actually talks about you reward people differently. You pay them differently based on their contribution. So it's a meritocratic system. Now, in a capitalist system, that usually should happen within the market. People who are the best innovators produce better products and stuff like that, pretty much go higher, get more, because they're more productive, they're more innovative, they create more value in society. Well, this was something similar, that these people were more productive, or they were contributing more to the social pie, so to speak, and so they got more of the perks. You could say a bit like in tribal society, they've got a different system, but it's similar in a way, because it's a more collective thing. But you basically say, well, the chief gets more of the animal, so to speak. So something along those lines. And then in their utopian communism, which never happened, but that sort of thing, they say to each according to his need. That means whatever your needs are, because there was a belief that at that stage there'd be so much wealth being produced. He still believed that there would be factories producing so much stupendous wealth. You could actually then just distribute it based on need. You didn't have to, under that sort of, it would be this utopian paradise and all that. Very unrealistic, but that's what they believed. So socialist stage, the first stage, and the second stage. The anarchists were their allies. They believed, well, you don't need the state to organize socialism. You can do it in an anarcho-syndicalist type of approach. So they used to be their allies, and then they broke apart because one believed that you must have the state in the first part. That's where they had their split. That was the first split within the left back in the 19th century, between the anarchists and the communists at the time. Some of them called themselves socialists, some of them called them, they had all sorts of names and variations because they weren't one thing. Later on, they became Marxist-Leninists, but back then they were all sorts of variations and colours and creeds, so to speak, in that regard. But there was one thing that I remember in the manifesto where he actually said you can only get to communism when you've got automata. They used the ancient Greek word for automation, that you have to have automation where the workers are no longer directly involved in the means of production, but indirectly. That means they control the machines that do all the work. So you've got like a slave army of machines producing everything, and then you're sitting up here. But that sounds more like, like the ancient Greece, in a sense, where you had the citizen, then you had the slaves underneath. Something similar to that, So, as I said, humans have constructed all sorts of systems that seem similar. It's just the different slave types that are generated in different systems. So, what I'm trying to say, guys, is humans never create anything perfect. They come up with certain things, but we should never misrepresent an ideology, is what I'm trying to say. Because a lot of people do misrepresent an ideology. It's like Adam Smith. Many people misrepresent Adam Smith. They think he didn't care about social issues. He did. He did care about a lot of things about social issues. Most people ignore those parts of Adam Smith. So there's a lot of people that historically have been misrepresented in one way or another. Whether you agree with them or don't agree with them is irrelevant. That's not the issue. The reality is both the communists and the capitalists are both going to be swept away by some sort of futuristic type economy where you will really have, for the first time, sometimes, I think, like you'll find certain programs in the where potentially you could actually end up with a society where you've got these just independent people, especially with the birth rate, the way it's going, independent people that just go out and just got their machines and just exploit their own resources, whatever they need. And because how much do you need? There's a threshold. Beyond that threshold, the only reason why the rich try to accumulate more and more wealth is not because they need anything or they're going to spend it. It's no way. It's power. It gives them power. That's what they want. But if you make a direct democracy, which is what I support and all that, then it becomes irrelevant even for them because they can't control the society anymore. So, then you go back to more practical things. If we can create all machines and we all can use these machines, then we just sit around in agora, just discussing amongst ourselves, like in ancient Greece, working out all the sort of things. And we don't need a political party. We don't need any of these elites political elites or wealth elites or whatever telling us how to run our society. We're basically we're like a technological tribal society in a sense. We're amongst ourselves, we work out, use blockchain to make decisions and stuff like that. And we've got all the machines doing the stuff and all that. That's probably a much nicer future that we could envision, and work towards a sort of a direct democracy with high technology, which serves the general humanity in a sense. That would be a much nicer vision. It still doesn't mean there wouldn't be crises. We're humans after all. We drag crises with us, and even if they're interpersonal, we're always going to have crises amongst ourselves, family crises, societal crises in general. It's just our human nature. We can't avoid it. But there are other approaches or other ways, and it may not be even my approach. There may be other approaches that may be more suitable for future societies or future people. I'm not going to basically. At some point, I do want to make a sort of a manifesto for direct democracy and sort of elaborate it and show using blockchain and having it's a quasi-representative. It's not like a traditional, like in ancient Greece, because you can do it at a local level, but you can't do it at a global level or at a national level. You've got to have some sort of structure, but those people are just going to be voted representatives. That's all. They're there, and you can have like a bunch of bureaucrats who they're there to undertake analysis of things, come up with ideas, and say, "Well, guys, what do you think? These are we put into effect, doesn't work. We scrap it, try something different." So that's sort of the way I'm thinking about it, because you can't have thousands of people trying to make a decision on this aspect or that aspect. You still got to, so you'll use people that are knowledgeable in specific areas, and those people would be like an advisory body to us citizens, and they would come back and say, well, we could fix this doing this, this, and this, and then we vote on it, whether we agree or disagree. But we take the decision and we live with the decision. If it doesn't work, a year down the track, we go, well, that doesn't seem to be working. We do a referendum and wipe it, get it off the statute and say, come up with a new idea. So that's the sort of way I'm envisioning the thing, and having certain mechanisms to be able to eliminate where people can actually do with blockchain, do a campaign. And if the majority of people say, yeah, would like to put it to the vote again, you can put it and eliminate it. And no expert or anybody can say no, because that's not their role. Their role is just to advise, not to rule. That's the difference. We would still rule. They would be an advisory body providing ideas of how to fix or sort out things. That's the sort of thing the way I'm envisioning it in that regard, with checks and balances and with a constitution that protects the rights of all groups without majority being able to suppress a minority group within the society. But without also, like in our modern world, we've got minority groups trying to impose their woke, transgender, transhuman, and whatever else agenda on the majority of us, because that's the modern world, which is far worse. Small groups forcing their crazy ideologies on the rest of us. So, even the ancient Greeks, at least, at worst, they sent you into exile. Most people that were sent into exile ended up either in other city-states, or they ended up in Persia. Like Themistocles, the guy that actually beat them in Salamis. Yeah, things like that. Now I think you've got a deeper understanding of the way I think. I don't think like other people. I don't really care the way other people think. I've had a long journey. I've had friends on the far right, like my second cousin, were very close. He used to be a sort of a well, not exactly one of those, Zig, whatever. But he was quite on the far right for back in the 70s and 80s. But Thanasi, Arthur was his name. We were very close, good friends. And my other closest friend was a communist. And the other one was a Maoist. I mean, the combination. Politically, they hated each other, but they were my best friends. And that was, as far as I was, that was and I did have another friend who was a social democrat, and he was from my old neighborhood, and I used to get on with him quite well, and a few other people, acquaintances, quite a few. But at the end of the day, I've gone through a lot of these sort of discussions with people. I've gone through reading so much about this. And the thing that I've realized in my whole life is that, there's nothing perfect. Most of the things that we construct as humans are pretty flawed in one way or another. At the end of the day, we need to, be practical in the sort of solutions we come up with, and less ideological is what I'm trying to get across to people. Because even in a direct democracy, you've got to jettison that ideology. You've got to be practical, what works and what doesn't, and be prepared to jettison what doesn't work. And that's the approach we need to keep in our minds, and even in our own life. What do we do? If I make a mistake, I learn from the mistake. I don't persist with it. That's ideology, to persist with it. You jettison. You go, well, that didn't bloody work, and you try something else. So like we encourage people to jettison this sort of blinkered approach in our lives, the way we live our lives, we should do that in politics as well. We shouldn't be welded to the Democrats or welded to the Republicans or welded to anything. If somebody's got good ideas that could help improve our society, they may not be perfect in everything. I'm not saying Trump's perfect in everything or Robert Kennedy's perfect in everything. They're not. I don't know whether there's other people out there in the US. For the US, in Australia, it's a basket case. I don't know. It's really becoming hard to find people that are of any useful utility in politics in this country. I'm really becoming disheartened. That's why I even thought about going into politics myself, joining the rat race of Canberra or the state legislator here in Tasmania once in a couple of years' time when I retire. Yeah, it's at some point we need to stand up, and that's truth, and get into the pit, so to speak. But I think if we promote constructive ideas and stuff like that, and I'm prepared to work with people who come from sort of different, slightly ideological backgrounds. I don't have a problem with that anymore. I used to in the past when I was younger, but that was my youth. Now I'm more interested in practically working with anyone to get solutions, things that work, that allow the community to work and become functional and work better. It's easy to destroy. It's easy to just take a rock, break a window. That's easy. To build is much harder, and I'm not going to claim that I've got all the solutions, because I don't. And that would be both not only hypocritical, but also would be extremely arrogant to think that I can know what the future holds or the way the world's going to play out or whatever. I'm guessing like everyone else. Maybe my guess is a bit closer because I'm better informed, but it doesn't mean they're perfect. None of us are. We're flawed in one way or another, and we're limited. We're not gods. And so we need to learn to listen and need to observe with a critical eye and at the same time discuss things with people, because sometimes you'll be surprised how other people will have thought about something that you haven't thought about, and that will refine your own thinking. Even your enemy can refine your thinking, can make you think about things. I didn't think about that, but I can come up with a better solution than that person's come up with. So never do this. Think, listen, think what you've heard. And when you do that, you'll be able to, contribute more to the community, and even to the carnival community. I sort of encourage you guys to challenge me all the time, because I know that those challenges are going to basically make me better at coming up with solutions or understanding things a bit deeper and being able to demystify things for you guys. So I need to be challenged as well. We need to, or we shouldn't fear being challenged, is what I'm trying to say. It's only the only people that fear are ideologues. We should be prepared to change and and shift our thoughts and our ideas to some extent. I'm not talking about core ideas, but when we see that that doesn't seem, maybe I have made a mistake there. Let me look into it a bit deeper in that regard. I mean, let's, even in the sort of the nutritional state, I had a lot of baggage from the paleo community. Even Bart had, when it came to the question of PUFA, we discussed it online once. Some of you, my older subscribers, remember that conversation, but it sort of changed his views on that. I sort of had thoughts in regards to the Randall cycle, but I had no idea about it. And coming across Bart, he really demystified it, and then it made sense. I go, I've always had thoughts, because I knew about Kempner, Walter Kempner in the 1930s, sort of research with the low fat and stuff like that. And I'm going, there's something here that's happening when you combine stuff. Something's not working. Why isn't it? I sort of thought it's probably because of the two. When you've put a lot of the animal foods and then you combine it with too many of these, that it was sort of potentially, my sort of thought was that it was the high glycating levels of the, because a lot of these low fat would generate less glycation on the food that you're intaking. So that's how I was taking it. I was viewing it from a glycation sort of point of view. And then when Bart sort of explained the Randall cycle, and I came across that thing, I'm going, oh, it's so obvious. So I had one of those epiphanies. I gave him a bit of an epiphany in terms of the PUFA stuff, animal PUFA. I sort of think that on the taurine side and the deuterium side, I've sort of pushed the envelope a bit more on that. He's sort of made me more aware about earthing and some of the light issues, blue light and stuff like that. Well, he had issues with his eyes, and so he had a bit more knowledge in that sort of, in those sort of areas. And so, but I didn't take a strong position. I was open, receptive, is what I'm trying to say. He was also, when he looked at the data and the facts that I presented on the PUFA thing, he goes, you're right. I agree. He looked at the research that I provided him. He looked at it and goes, yeah, you're right. It's bullshit. There's only trace amounts, even of these massive amounts and this massive time of cooking. It's bullshit. He could see the obvious because he looked at the data and realized, yeah, Harry's right on this point. I was receptive as well, because when he presented Randall cycle and stuff like that, I go, it's right. Shit, that's what I was missing. But most people are so ideological with their fucking flag, tribal flag, and and that's the problem. This is why Bart goes after everyone. And I sort of, to some extent as well, quite critical. We have a different approach. Let's put it that way. But most of you that have put comments, you've probably heard me where I'll go, this, and this, and this, and this reason why, and I'll give you reasons why you're wrong. It's like Bart. And both of us, he's actually even more careful with his language than I am. And I've learned from him to be much careful, show care and restraint. Because I used to have a bit of a tendency of not exaggerating, but, I was pulling out the flag on certain things where I go, put it away, Harry. There's still a bit, the data, it sort of indicates there, but it's more of an inference. It's not, really pushing. It's not strong enough. So it's made me far more disciplined. I have to thank Bart for that, because he's a very disciplined person, and that's one thing I love about him. And I've learned a lot from that disciplined approach, and all of us can learn from that sort of way of thinking, because it's very easy to fall into crack pottery, as I've said in the past. Very easy, even for people like me, anyone. So we need to be, sometimes we really, really want to, and all that. And as I've pointed out to people, you have to have, that doesn't mean there should be a foundation in your thinking. I mean, there is a strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force. There are certain things that are well established experimentally, time dilation and many other things. Those things are what I call foundational beliefs, because they're well established experimentally and can't be disputed by anyone. Now, they can be reinterpreted how they interact with other laws or other things that may have not been solidified yet. But that doesn't mean that they, even gravity, the description is different, but the effects are the same between Newtonian. That's why you still can use the mathematics of Newton to push rockets into space. So in that regard, it's just a different way of describing the same effect. So that's the sort of stuff, but the core stuff, because they've been measured, established. And it's the same thing with the N15 data. Me and Bart on that are, just like that. And the reason why we are, that's our foundation. It's in the bones. It's indisputable. It's not even for conversation. What are you going to say? All the crackpots, all they go is, it's probably this condition and probably that condition. They come up with a whole lot of bizarre excuses. Or some animal, like an antelope in Africa, that eats bark, which is very high in N15, and sort of distorts, but is also much lower in some of the other isotopes, which sort of put together what the source of, that it's not another animal that they're eating. We know that the carbon type means that the animal was feeding on grass. And since our N14 is low, we weren't feeding on the grass. It was the animal that we're eating that was feeding on the grass. N15 high, delta 13. And now we've got the zinc stuff in the bone, in the teeth. Pretty much settled. It's pretty much a slam dunk, as somebody would call it in that regard. So we've got the foundation. So we know what our species consumed for the majority of its existence. All these other sort of associated studies are just associated claptrap. That's all they are. And most of the sort of things where even some of the associations They're in people eating a mixed diet or a sad diet, Randall cycle engagement. So what is it? Is it the Randall cycle that's being engaged? The glycating factors, the things that are staying in the bloodstream for too long, glycating and whatever else, and oxidizing? Is it that? Or is it some of those compounds? You can't discern. They're all associated. You know? It is every single molecule in that technically should be associated. But the selective, it's only the saturated fat, only the anon component. We're going to ignore the other stuff. Because when we consume the other stuff on its own, we don't see that, obviously, because Randall cycle is not being engaged. That's why you don't see it, you crackpot. They're selective with the truth and stuff like that. That's the problem. We should challenge them. But there are foundational stuff that they can't dispute. But they ignore, because that's the easiest way. Ignore it and just say, oh, look at this study, which is, fabricating or being constructed in a way to bring a certain outcome to support a certain narrative. And you go, oh, let's just look at the design of this, and let's look at the data that's been and has it been adjusted and what they've done to it. And then you'll realize, okay, this is another propaganda piece. So it's hard for a lot of people that don't have the schooling or don't have the knowledge or stuff like that. And I've been doing this sort of stuff, looking into science and philosophy and all sorts of things from my teenage years. So I'm quite versed in this sort of shit. And Bart is similar for many years, many a moons. So we're quite versed, and it's hard for the average person. That's why you guys come to us and challenge us with things, which is fine. And we sort of explain the stuff and all that, which is what we're meant to. I hope I'm explaining things in a reasonable way and as easy as I can. Sometimes, I've noticed I've had to make a couple of additional videos right after I've done a video, because I haven't explained it clear enough and all that. Do call me on it, just do point to it and say, Harry, look, I did not really understand this part or that part. And I'll make another video on it. I may not make it immediately. Sometimes I do. And I won't show anything. I'll just explain. Sort of I'll do an explanatory, like a supplemental type thing. I don't mind doing that because if I'm not explaining things, then I'm wasting my time. So I've got a day job, I've got a life, I've got other things. This isn't my main gig. It's not my income. So if I'm not basically explaining it, why am I bothering? So yes, I don't mind being challenged. I don't mind people saying, well, can you explain this or whatever? Don't mind explaining either, because it's, if you guys are better informed, you understand things a bit deeper, got a better understanding, then you're able then to contribute to both the carnivore community, but also to the wider community with, some deeper knowledge and all that. At the same time, it doesn't mean you go around, doing that to people. You sometimes just little seeds of encouragement, little seeds of, showing the contradictions. And that's where the knowledge from me, from Bart and other people in the community comes, where you can actually say, what about this? Let them think, let them come back and all that, and ask for more. And, and gauging on how much interest and more, how much they want to learn. You'll pace the conversation at that sort of level, which is what you should do. Anyway, it started from one thing. It's ended up, but it is Harry Sopanos after all. My nature. I could talk forever on all sorts of issues and But what I'm trying to do with this video is clear up some confusion. But I think that really the thing that I'm really trying to do, and I'll be completely candid about it, is I'm trying to get you guys to think, to think, you know, you've been given free will by your creator to think, not to be sheep, is what I'm really trying to get you. You know, some of you guys, you know, when it comes to certain practical things, like in agriculture or whatever, you know, how to run something in society, you may come with better ideas because you've got a deeper understanding of that than even me or so-called experts. So don't devalue yourself is what I'm saying. We all have life experiences. We all have knowledge. And society is made up of many parts, and all those parts require different types of experience, expertise, and whatever else. You know, so don't devalue yourself is what I'm saying. But what I'm trying to get you to think independently, in a sense, you know, for yourselves as people, to be able to think outside the box or think independently and not be just pulled by, you know, dragged around by the nose, so to speak, to be able to have a certain level of understanding what's happening out there and how things are working. And that's what I'm trying with some of these videos, is sort of to give you insights, because you hear bullshit on the media, and I try to give you a bit of a background story, like the Sudan stuff. So you guys know, and you go, yeah, okay, we really know what's happening there. Forget about the bullshit, and that's it. HD actually left. He's from that region. Left a bit of a message and talked about the Eritrea situation. There is a bit of extended other things are happening in that area as well. That you know, there's the oil fields, and there's also a strategic choke points for the US down in Djibouti. You've got a Chinese and an American base. I know it's crazy, and and the French are down there as well. It's just wild. One country having all these relationships. Yes, can easy world, but there is so much. We're in a multipolar world, and we're in this sort of period of a lot of global competition by major powers and medium powers as well. It's not only major powers, but also medium powers. Everybody's shuffling around trying to get the edge on their neighbors, on others, and all that. And major powers are also exploiting and using proxy states, you know, that they agree with and have got, you know, common interests in that region. And that's why you've got these strange alliances all over the place. And people have alliances at the moment are not solidified, is another thing that most people don't understand. And this is why, you know, the Europeans look at the Americans uncertain, the Americans look at the Europeans and others uncertain. Things are in flux. There's a lot of uncertainty. And really, we've caused this ourselves, you know. Expensive energy has really rattled the cage of the world, made things a bit more precarious because we grew because of cheap energy and being, let's say, encouraged to basically just be profligate. We've created a mountain of debt, and we've also stuffed up the system in a big way. And that's why we are where we are. And at this stage, things are, you know, grinding away, and there's all these frictions, and There's food supply issues, there's supply chain issues that haven't been resolved. And so even certain goods being exported or being imported in certain countries is still problematic. So there's a lot of problems out there. I mean, even recently I was looking at, just some new devices and computers and stuff like that. And certain companies have got certain of the new models out and others haven't yet because they just can't get supply of certain parts. They want to, but so there's a lot of disruption still in the global supply chain, post-COVID and all that. And it doesn't help that we've got expensive energy, which is making it more difficult to meet that demand. And so obviously we're getting the inflation because we can't meet that demand because of, it's not, the supply chain issues would resolve much better if we had cheaper energy, because then we'd start be able to produce things that we've neglected to start getting things working properly again. It would probably still take about 5 to 7 years to sort out a lot of this, but at least it would take the heat out of the system, and it would sort of allow things to sort of cruise along, not entirely satisfactorily in a sense, but without escalating even further, is what I'm trying to say. So there's no quick fix for this, but the primary number one thing that we need to do is get cheap energy back into the system. I don't care how. I don't give a flying toss how. We just need to get cheap energy in. This is fundamental. I don't care what you do. You go around with your baby and scream at the politicians to provide cheap energy. I don't care what you do. Your number one priority should not be any of the other issues, because a lot of the other issues are a consequence of the current crisis in many regards, to some extent, or whatever. Some of them are not. Obviously the transhuman agenda has other reasons for it, but it is still associated with wokeness, green shit, veganerized agendas and all that. They're all tied in from the same people, these globalists. But fundamentally, if we can sort out the energy system, then we get a bit of a breather to be able to deal with the other issues. Because at this stage, it is critical, if we're going to avoid massive global conflict. I'm not kidding you guys. We saw high inflation and then deflation, hyperinflation, and then deflation bring about monsters on planet Earth and a massive world war. We want to avoid that. And the only way we're going to avoid that is cheap energy. Anyway, see yous.